Hey, I want to ask you a question today. Have you ever had to deal with the dragon of discouragement? How about the dragon of depression? Hi, as you know, I'm Mike Sherbino, and here on Transformation all through this month, we've been dealing with that issue that's referred to as the mental health crisis. And all across the country, people are finally starting to open up and saying, let's talk about what we've swept under the carpet for so many years. And today in particular, we have a couple with us, Allan and Bonnie Gallant, who are going to talk about the whole stigma, not just of mental health, but of mental health in the church. Allan's a former pastor. He still serves in pastoral capacity, but he's gone through an incredible crisis in his own life. And he and his wife are here to share with you their amazing story. I want you to know that you can defeat the dragon of discouragement and depression that you're facing today in your life. Listen carefully as Allan and Bonnie unpack their amazing story. Well, welcome again to Transformation. I'm so delighted today to have Bonnie and Allan Gallant with us, all the way from Cape Breton.
Hey.
Down homers.
That's right.
I didn't quite make it to Fantasy Island, but I did live in Nova Scotia, so we just made fun of you folks.
Yeah, I'm sure you did.
But you guys made fun of us as well.
We all the time.
You know, we're smiling a little bit today, but for the whole month we've been dealing with actually a heavy subject. And sometimes I've discovered in the midst of painful moments that we find laughter really is a good medicine. But sometimes it's hard to laugh in the midst of the tears. And I want you to jump right in and talk to me for a moment, because you've served in pastoral ministries. You also serve in a ministry that we're going to talk about in a few minutes that helps churches understand mental illness. Why is there such a stigma about mental illness?
Well, first of all, I had to realize what stigma was. And it's just defined by a mark of disgrace associated with circumstance, quality, or person. And so when we have mental health, we're identified as those that have a disgrace marker on us. And so the church often has a hard time understanding mental health, and the stigma is there.
Bonnie, what's been your experience with this whole stigma?
Absolutely. I know when Al first was sick and we had to go into the mental health unit. And when that first night, he said, don't share this with anybody. You know, we wanted to keep it private because this was going to be our story, and just the fear of letting people know or letting them in that we were really not in a good place. We were afraid of that until the next day. And he said, you know, we need to share our story. We need to make
You know, the fact that you're here today and you have a story to share tells our viewers that you've come through a process. But you hit a brick wall.
I did.
So why don't you back up and talk to us about what was happening in your life?
Sure.
You're working 100 miles an hour.
Yeah.
But you tell the story.
Well, very quickly, I was in pastoral ministry for 33 years, and I never really took care of myself. I was just going. What I mean is, many people said to me, you need to slow down. You're gonna crash someday. And I was young enough to think that I never would crash.
Well, especially you're from Cape Breton.
Right,
You're
you know.
invincible.
We're made of the strong stuff.
You know, I'm like Superman, you know. But anyway, over the years, different things that I never dealt with, like discouragement and some, trauma in ministry. And also just growing up as a boy, some things that I had to deal with and I never did. And so when I got to our church plant that we did back in 2010, I'm not in a good place then. I was really, I would say I was in a clinical depression at that point, because it was something that I battled with over time.
Did you know that at the time?
I didn't know what it was.
Bonnie, what was he like to live with at that point?
Don't share.
Now, do I have to be honest? he wasn't
Only all
himself.
of Canada's watching.
Yeah, great. You know what? He was very much himself at times, but it was very difficult because I felt that we were on edge.
Yeah.
Like I just didn't know what it might have been that might have ticked him off. The simplest things of leaving a pillow on a floor
Right.
was something that aggravated him.
Yeah, I was agitated all
the time.
And I had no passion for what I was doing anymore.
But you wore a mask too.
I did.
Because you certainly portrayed something totally different among other people. But I knew really what he was like. But you know what? And I never really even challenged him on that. I don't think. You know, it was just like, okay, he's going through this and just let him be.
So tell the story in the next 2 minutes, 2 or 3 minutes, and then we're going to jump back and relive some things because you have an interesting French accent.
Yeah, it's
You
not
didn't
French.
always have that accent, did you?
No, I didn't. I had a stroke back in 2017, which it was a severe stroke, and I was on my way to being paralyzed, but I got to the hospital in time, and they gave me a clot buster, and so I was able to regain my movements in my right side, but my voice was gone.
Totally gone.
Totally gone. I couldn't say a word. I tried and tried, but nothing would come out.
Were you terrified?
I was scared. Yeah, very much.
What were you feeling, Bonnie?
I didn't even know at the time. I was at work, and when I got the call, actually from the nurse on the way, I was afraid that I wasn't even going to make it to the hospital. And then when I realized he couldn't even speak, you know, of course, a lot of fear was in our lives at that point. Totally overwhelming.
And you were dealing with mental illness. You're dealing with the clinical depression prior to this.
Yeah, I was.
So this was just on top of things.
It was, yeah.
Had you stopped pastoring at that point?
Yes, full time.
Okay.
I was working a couple of part-time positions in 2 churches, but really I was doing it just because I needed a paycheck, and I wasn't really doing it because I wanted to do it. I had lost all my focus on who I was as a pastor and who I was as a man. And I didn't care anymore. And
So jump ahead. Fill in the story for me, Bonnie.
And he really lost his passion for the church. Because I remember it just was always very critical. Like we would go to different churches and it was, you know, the good old let's slam the pastor at lunchtime, or just things just weren't the way that you wanted to see them. And we just became very critical of the church. Or you were more critical, but it overflows. Because then you become the same judgment, you know, starts with both of us.
What was it like living with a man who, when you realized he was diagnosed with clinical depression, how did you process that as a person of faith?
Wow. I know for myself in the beginning, it was like, how is this even happening to Allan and I? Because a lot of people, not saying this in an arrogant way, but looked up to us. And we're kind of a bit of the, you know, the ideal couple, I guess. And then trying to process my husband, the leader in a clinical depression, and then as the leader of a church, like how do you reconcile the two together? And that was really difficult to try to understand that.
But I think it was something that gave her some understanding, clarity about why I was the way I was before the stroke and before I went into this mental health breakdown after the stroke.
It was like the puzzle piece finally fit. It's like, okay, so this is why.
So how long did it take for your speech to come back?
Well, in 3 hours, I was able to speak my first word. I said okay, but not very well. But I couldn't speak much more than that for a couple of days. But my speech was really slow and very mumbly. So it took 2, 3, 4 weeks to really be able to
understand
say,
you even, really. Probably I would say closer to a month.
Or a statement, like a question, you know. So then I had to get the help to learn how to speak again, learn how to even form my letters. or sound my letters, and for my tongue. My soft palate in my mouth was damaged, and that's, I believe, why I have this accent. You know, I sound like I have a French accent. People ask me where I'm from. You know, I say I'm from Cape Breton, and they can't believe it because they think I'm from Quebec. You know.
Well, that's not such a bad thing.
No, it's not.
So that's
but
good.
It's funny sometimes.
It gives you a passport to go to both countries.
It does.
Because Cape Breton's a world of its own.
That's right. It is.
As I picked up on Allan being so transparent and saying how he thought he could do everything, he ran at a hectic pace. I'm reminded of so many young men, older men, young women, older women who are running hard. It's as if we're trying to prove ourselves all the time. In the midst of our humanity, I hear the voice of Jesus when he calls us saying, "Be still and know that I am God," where he says, "In quietness and confidence shall be your strength." I believe that one of the cures for the depression and the discouragement that often hangs over our lives, if we peel back the facade, is the fact that we're afraid to actually be still, to know that we are loved by God just for who we are. The psalmist said in Psalm 40, "I waited patiently on the Lord, and he inclined unto me and heard my cry, and he brought me up out of a miry pit and put my feet on a rock." We're going to come back and hear the rest of the story of Bonnie and Allan and the journey that they had to come out of the miry pit onto the rock. And it was an understanding that God loved them, not for what they did, but for who they were, that they were children of God. So we smile in the midst of this, but you've gone through an incredible journey. So I'm processing the emotional trauma that you're feeling in the midst of this.
Yeah.
You're people of faith, you've pastored, you've led churches. You're going through a hard time. Where is God in the midst of all this? Yeah. How did that, your understanding of God being with you, how was that impacted?
Well, for me, I knew God was with me from the very beginning of the crisis, because I knew that I knew in my spirit that God permitted this for a reason. Now we're all broken. Many have strokes and many have heart attacks and get cancer, and we know it's because we're broken. We're broken bodies and people. But for me, I knew God had this in his plan to get my attention. So right from the very beginning, I knew God was in this. I didn't like it, but I knew he did it for my good. And so all through the journey, I knew God was in this, even though there was one point that I was very angry, and I told him how angry I was and why would he allow this to happen to me. But were really a lot of reasons why he allowed this to happen to me.
Now you have 5 children,
Yes.
so I connect with that because I have 5 daughters as well.
Well, I have 5. She has 6. She said I'm her 6th one.
Yeah, we're not going to argue that.
We won't even go there.
Not even going to
No.
go there. Bonnie, talk to me. What were you processing about things in your mind with your walk with God, and maybe even speak a little bit for your children? How did they navigate all this as they watched what was happening to their mom and dad?
Like I said earlier, it was hard to believe that this was even happening, and the fear of, honestly, was I going to be left a widow? And as we journeyed through this, we were talking about this just the other day, there were points as he journeyed through, especially the mental health issues and stuff afterwards, that I thought it would have been easier maybe to be a widow than it was to have to continue this journey. So that was one of the things that went through my head. It was like, how are we going to maneuver through this and get through the next part? But there was a song that we just kept, we would literally, as a family, we would put earphones in and sing, I'm no longer a slave to fear. I am a child of God. And that was just resonated in our hearts, knowing that he loved us so much, that he allowed that, because it was really for the good of Allan and I, and for our children, because at that point, they were our foundation,
Yeah.
weren't they? Other than the Lord, obviously, but our kids rallied around us, and they were there. They were there at the hospital before I even got there.
Yeah.
The kids
Let me
were.
pick up on that song, No Longer a Slave to Fear. And you think with me, because we're just doing this unscripted, I want you to unpack that. But many people who are dealing with depression, I'm sure there's a fear inside of them saying, when will I ever be normal?
That's
when
right.
will I ever be free of this dark cloud?
And that was me, because I didn't think I was going to be normal again, and there was a dark cloud, but God showed me the light, But
Were there days for you when you crashed?
Absolutely. There's
yeah.
still days. There's still days I crash. And there's days just talking about that song, I remember not that long ago, maybe several months ago, and it came on the radio, and I literally got to my knees in my kitchen and just praised the Lord again to say, I'm no longer a slave to fear.
What were you afraid of? You talked about being a widow,
Being a widow.
maybe dealing with this guy.
Yeah, like how am I going to do it? I am his caregiver and will continue to be his caregiver. So
But that's a huge challenge.
it's a major
Especially if
challenge.
someone is not operating in full capacity or full strength.
And you wonder for yourself, am I going to be strong enough to pay attention to the signs? Will I be strong enough to help him through that? So being a
And
caregiver
sometimes those
for someone-
vows, for better or for,
for
worse,
worse, yeah, you think
come back to haunt you, don't they?
in
Yeah,
sickness
because
and
this-
in health.
that's right. This wasn't the plan that we had for each other.
No.
One of the greatest things that can sustain you through the ups and downs of life is knowing that God can be trusted. I appreciate Allan being so honest and sharing about the discouraging time, the clinical depression that he was in. But underneath it all was the confidence that God was with him, that he was not going to fail him or forsake him, even though he felt he was at a low, low point in his life. Earlier this week, I was reading in the scriptures in Psalm 112, and it reminded me of what Allan said. It says, "The righteous will never be moved. He will be remembered forever by the Lord. He's not afraid of bad news. His heart is firm, trusting in the Lord. His heart is steady. He will not be afraid." As I read that verse, it reminds me of the reality that we all face, of our humanity, of what the psalmist was going through. He knew that there would be bad times, that there would be difficult times, but in the midst of that, he could trust in God. And regardless of where you're at right now, can I remind you that God can be trusted? You might not understand why, but you can still trust him right now. So God began to write a new plan.
He did.
Tell me about that.
Well, the new plan was birthed out of our crisis, because when I was in the lowest points of my life with this mental health disorder that I have to live with now for the rest of my life, I was in the mental health unit in a hospital, and I saw the brokenness of people. And I saw that even as a pastor who was struggling so much in his own darkness, I was helping people in the hospital. I was reading. I couldn't read very good, but I was reading what I could, and many of them came to me for prayer, and so God used me in that situation, and so it birthed in me the need to care for others and help others who are in the similar state as I am. And so when I got more healthy and we got more stronger, this burden to help people was really a great passion.
I think it's interesting that God still delighted to use you, even when you were kind of frustrated with him. And you'd been pastoring and just probably felt like you're going through the motions.
Yeah, but that was my parish.
That was
And
the
I
hospital.
was, we weren't like in chains or locked in our rooms, but we were in a unit that we couldn't get out of. So I had people there that they were hopeless. They were feeling hopeless. And I knew that I still had the light of the world inside of me, and the hope that people can have. So I would just sit with people and pray with them and share my story with them, and they were so willing to receive it, So we don't know what God has done with these people that we minister to.
You have a ministry that's called Agora Network Ministries.
Yeah.
What's that all about, Bonnie?
Well, when we were in that darkest point of ministry and just thinking we're done with the church and ministry, we kept saying we're done, but it was like, what are we going to do? That's all we know,
Yeah.
For 30 some years, that's all we know. It's been our heartbeat, but at the same time, it was like, we're done. But I knew deep down that God wasn't finished with us, that he still wanted us in ministry. And when we talked about that, we said, he's got to use this somehow. And then Agora was a name that Al had way back in his head for a long time. And it's where the people gather, is what the name of it is. So, of course, our heartbeat is for the church.
Yeah.
And not just the church, a lot of our heartbeat is for pastors and their wives, too. The journey that they're going through, it's not easy. It's not an easy profession.
Yeah. So what do you do with the ministry? What's the focus? What's your goal?
Well, we want to educate, engage, and equip the local church to the mental health issues inside the church, so they can find resources, they can find counseling, and they can find a network of ministries and help that they can plug into. I was talking very briefly today with a lady. Their pastor just was on a medical leave just now because he's burnt out, So we want to help the pastors and wives with the resources that we have.
It's a powerful story, and I'm just excited. I just want to say today that they can see the address coming across the screen right now, that you're available to go and help and to equip and to educate churches. But there's people watching right now, and they're looking on, they're hearing your story, and they're saying, boy, I wish that my outcome could be as good as yours.
Right.
We don't know how the script is going to be written.
No.
We're writing it together with God. What word of hope and encouragement would you give to people today who are struggling with mental illness or maybe a stroke or something else that's been debilitating?
I think, first of all, don't let the stigma of your crisis define you.
Yeah.
You're defined in Jesus Christ. That's first. And so there's always hope and there's always healing in him. How he does it is up to him. So each story is different, but I think just planting your feet in what you know, the truth of God, I think is necessary.
Bonnie, let me ask you a final question. To those that are in a supporting role, what word of direction or encouragement would you say to them today?
I would say, if you're sitting in the seat of being the helper, don't be afraid to ask for help.
Oh, don't be afraid to ask for help.
And that's where I'm even learning this now, of don't be afraid not to be so strong. Have people come and rally around you. Accept their help. Don't think that you're strong enough to do it on your own, because I thought I was. And so sometimes we push away people and we actually rob them of blessing of being able to help us through this. So if you're sitting in the seat of being the helper, be willing to get help for yourself too. It's so important. It's a hard journey, and you have to keep yourself healthy too.
And as I look at the two of you, if I could add a third part, is that never doubt the fact that God is writing his own story through your lives and through each of you that are listening today. Bonnie and Allan, thank you for coming. I've only known you a short time now, but I feel like we're long lost friends, and I've come to love you, even though you're from Cape Breton. So how cool is that? I love you, yeah. And you know what? I know you love me.
Yeah,
and that's just kind of a neat thing in the family of God.
Yeah.
And thank you for being transparent, for being vulnerable.
You're welcome.
It's helped me immensely. I don't want to pretend. I want to be honest. I want to be real.
Right.
And we want you to know today that as you're listening, that you can be real, that you can be honest with God and know that he loves you, he cares for you, and there are people willing to come around you to support you in your place of need. We all want to know how to rise above the situation that we're in, especially if it's something like Allan and Bonnie that they have gone through. And you likely, as you're watching today, perhaps you're facing an illness. Maybe it's been something that's been lingering for years. Maybe it's a family matter that's dragged you down. And could it be the emotional baggage that you've been carrying because of things that have been done to you? I don't know your script, but I know that God knows your script. And if I can be as transparent as possible, it would be to take you to the scriptures and together for a few moments just to unpack how the Apostle Paul handled discouraging moments, things that could have been classified as very depressing for him. In the book of Philippians, it's a book on how to have joy no matter what. We find Paul writing from a prison cell, waiting to be executed. And one of the things I realized first and foremost that takes away our joy, that causes discouragement and even depression, is the fact of circumstances. And Paul writes this, he said, "I thank my God in all my remembrance of you, always in every prayer of mine for you all, making my prayer with joy." Paul was confident that even though he was in the last place that he wanted to be, a prison cell, that God was still writing the story. Remember, I just talked to you a moment ago about the importance of trusting God. This is where trust plays itself out. How do you handle those things? I remember my mother telling me a story about my grandfather that I had not known. His wife had died, my mother's mother, when she was very young, leaving 4 young children for him to navigate on his own. He owned a sawmill, and while he was attending the funeral for his own wife, and the men from the sawmill were with him, the sawmill went up in flames. He lost everything. He'd lost his wife, his livelihood, but he wouldn't let the circumstances define him. Actually, he went into politics, but that's a whole other story in itself. And maybe you feel like everything has gone up in flames. The circumstances have been hard, but they don't have to define you. Let God write a new story right now. Ask him to set you free from the emotional baggage that you're carrying. Some of the baggage that Paul had to deal with was the criticism of people. They were even Christians. They were putting a stigma on him that he really wasn't worthy to be the representative for the church that God had raised him up to be. They said nasty things about him, but he wouldn't let that define him. And he said, regardless, whatever is happening, I know the gospel is being preached, and I'm going to rejoice in that. Paul also said something else. He talks about things that take away our joy and cause depression, discouragement. It's the lack of things. He said in Philippians 4:19, "My God will supply all your need according to his riches in glory." And last but not least, in that same little book, he said, don't worry, don't be anxious. He said, daily trust God to sustain you. And even in the days when you are anxious, remember this, God still loves you. He's walking with you. Surround yourself with friends. Reach out to that network of people in the local church that will support you. And know this, that God, he loves you, and he is walking with you today.